Hello, Ben. Shalom.
How you doing?
Thank God. 1 second. Is there like a little lag? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear.
Awesome. How are you, sir?
I'm doing pretty well. We didn't meet last week, right? It was only a week.
Correct.
A week off?
We're a week off. That's it.
Okay.
We finished chapter 6, and we were going to, and we will start chapter 7.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from that, kids are okay. Wife is okay.
Yeah, everything's good, Baruch Hashem. We will probably be traveling to New York to see some families over Passover, so that would be nice.
That's fun.
But other than that, yeah. How are things with you?
Good. Thank God. Work's going well. That's it. We're getting closer to Pesach. So, on one hand, there's a lot I want to get done by that date. On the other hand, there is the sense of, that's it. It's winding down. Like stores can't take in new orders. So sort of like there's nothing else to be done at this point. Just finish things up and move into Pesach. So I'm excited about that.
Nice.
Okay. So by the way, Ben, when's the next time you're coming to Israel to come to visit?
No exact date. I mean, hopefully this year at some point, maybe September. That's what's in the roadmap. What we don't know yet.
I got you. So when you do come, and if you come, let me know. We'll meet up, Ezrat Hashem, assuming we have time. All right. Let's take it away.
Yes, let's do it.
הרבה ימצא במדרשות באגדות, ויש מהן בגמרא, שיש מן הנביאים מי שיראה השם יתברך מאחורי מחיצות רבות, ומהם מי שיראהו מאחורי מחיצות מעוטות. לפי קרבתם אל השם יתברך, ולפי מעלתם בנבואה. עד שאמרו, משה רבנו עליו השלום, רואה השם יתברך מאחורי מחיצה אחת בהירה, כלומר מזהירה, והוא אומרם, הסתכל באספקלריה המאירה. ואספקלריה, שם המרען הנעשה מגוף המזהיר כשוהם ובזכוכית, כמו שהתבאר בסוף כלים. Take it away. Very famous concept of aspaklaria meira.
Okay. So concerning the barrier between God and man and its signification. Many passages are found in the Midrash, the Agadah, and also the Talmud, which state that some of the prophets beheld God from behind many barriers, and some from beyond only a few, according to the proximity of the prophet to him and the degree of his prophetic power. Consequently, the rabbis said that Moses, our teacher, saw God from behind a single clear, that is, transparent partition. As they express it, Moses, looked through a translucent specularia. Specularia is the name of a mirror made of transparent body like crystal or glass, as is explained at the end of Tractate Kelim.
Can you check footnote 3? I'm just interested what they say about specularia. It just lets you know where it's been. I got it. It's just the reference. Okay, I thought it would give me more about that. Schleif Adams, try to join. The link is wrong. My link is wrong? Okay, we'll try again. Oh. Welcome. Okay, I just sent it again, so hopefully it works. Okay, so really, the Rambam over here is using this blood. I hope you're doing well. Family's okay?
Yeah, thank you. See you.
Glad to hear. And glad that you're here to join us. Sorry for the wrong link. So right, we were saying that Rambam gives his famous, it's not his, he mentions this famous example, right, of right, seeing prophecy through, different screens, partitions, what did he call them over here? What did we just say?
Specularium?
No, scroll up and just, how does the translation call it over here? A partition. Okay, fine, no partition. So he's looking through these partitions, and this is how we're seeing the divine through, right? So he's talking about how the lesser prophets, right, they're only seeing it through this this opaque barrier, right? And Moses really sees through like this clear, beautiful pane of glass, right? The aspeclaria that we're talking about, and really basically like he's using the Gemara, the Talmud over here as his source, really that they're seeing it through like this muddied, cloudy lens, right? We have to realize over here that he focuses on Moses and how Moses had this uniquely clear prophetic vision, right? And the way we, let's say, some of the traditional commentators explain this is that Moses, his unobstructed intellect, right? This imagination also he had allowed him uniquely to see things extremely, extremely clearly, right? His soul was very, very pure, and there's minimal obstructions, right? There's minimal mechitzot, partitions. So that's why he could ultimately understand this divine truth. Our sages talk about how God is speaking mitoch grono, from within his throat. And there's been different interpretations. One saying, Moses managed to fully nullify himself, and that's why he could be fully, God could fully come through, right? And that's why he at this level that not only does he see God clearly, but God is speaking through him. And others have spoken about, that he was actually so confident with himself and who he was, and he was so balanced, and that's why God spoke clearly through him, right? God doesn't require that we nullify himself. God requires that we actually balance ourselves properly, and that's how we could see through. But ultimately, Rambam is interpreting these mechitzot, these partitions, as these are spiritual imperfections, right? These are not physical barriers, right? It's not like there's an actual thing in the sky, but spiritually, this is creating a separation. And the more, let's say, morally or intellectually refined a prophet is, so there's less mechitzot, there's less of these partitions or veils that are blocking his perception of Hashem, of God. And this is really sort of introducing us to the theme of this chapter, which is the closeness to God, and prophecy obviously ultimately depends on the inner perfection of the person. And he's going to go into that in a little more in depth as we continue. Thoughts, comments, complaints?
I'm not sure if this is really important or critical, but I think there is a sort of unified view to the two like diametrically opposed views that you were presenting about Moses, which is like there is a way there's a way of nullifying yourself, at the extreme is sort of unified with being very much yourself and confident in yourself and those things at the extreme. And I think like they are different paths for sure. Like if you're a person, orienting yourself one way or another is a very different attitude. But I do think like when you're talking about the sort of perfect state to which you could reach with either of them, I think they sort of meet.
I actually look at it sort of more like what we have with the Nazir, right? Which is like you could decide to remove yourself, and by that, like sort of nullifying yourself and retracting, right? And that is a hack, so to speak, to reach this divine level. But you bring the sin offering because God is really wanting you to fully do that through expression of everything, right? So I'm with you that the nullification is a path. And hence the rabbis felt comfortable to say that that's what Moses is doing, right? But I would say, let's say, as far as let's say the Rambam, his attitude would be like, no, find that balance where you actually do get, you get this expression ultimately. But yeah, I agree. I agree that those are both. You could create that unity over there.
I guess what I mean to say is like there's a sense in which when you are most at peace with yourself, and the world, there is a sense in which, like, you could call it in like the Eastern tradition something like ego death, right? Like there is the nullification of the egoic self in the place where you need to go if you want to be something like on the order of magnitude of Moses.
Right. So I think we should get into this later about atzvut, right? One of the critics, and there I would say also sort of the idea of the ego death, or even like in the Eastern religions, you could see that there's sort of like this holy depression, and like I sort of feel like and Maimonides will talk about this, how the idea of simcha, right, where there's a sense where like, no, like that is a path, but or at the very least, that's not the path for the Jews. It's not that it's not a path, right? Like this goes back to the idea that we've spoken about in the past, that Abraham gives gifts to the sons of the concubines. There's interpretations that go into the idea of that being Ishmael, but there are those that talk about he gave them gifts, and it says Mekedem. It's like a double use of kedem in the pasuk of far east, and the idea is over there is he natan lem shemot tum'ah. He gave them names of impurity, or our knee-jerk reaction in, let's say, the Orthodox world, or let's say in Jewish Orthodox world, but even just generally from religious jargon, tum'ah or impurity seems like something bad, but really the sense is that it could be impure for the Jews, but that's not necessarily impure, generally speaking, for the East. That would not only be impure, actually, it's something holy. But that's a deeper topic to get into. Okay, Hemshachnu, Ben, you with us?
I am with you, yeah.
Okay. Okay, and והכוונה בזה העניין, מה שאומר לך, והוא שאנחנו ביארנו בפרק השני, right? חזרה. שהמעלות, מהן מעלות שכליות, ומהן מעלות המידות. וכן הפחיתויות, מהן פחיתויות שכליות, כסכלות ומעוט ההבנה ודוחק התבונה, ומהן פחיתויות המידות, כרוב התאווה והגאווה, הרוגז והכעס, והעזות ואהבת הממון והדומה להן, והן רבות מאוד. וכבר זכרנו הסדר בידיעתן בפרק הרביעי, ואילו הפחיתויות כולן הן מחיצות המבדילות בין האדם ובין השם יתברך. ומאמר הנביא מאמר זה, כי אם עוונותיכם היו מבדילים ביניכם ובין אלוהיכם. כלומר, אין ישעיהו שעוונותינו והן אלו רעות. כמו שזכרנו, הן המחיצות המבדילות בינינו ובינו יתברך. Okay. 1 second. Scroll back down. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Let me now explain the above statement. In accordance with what we have made clear in chapter 2, virtues are either intellectual or moral. Similarly, vices are intellectual, as ignorance, stupidity, and want of understanding, or they are moral, as inordinate lust, pride, irascibility, anger, impudence, avarice, and many other similar defects, a list of which we have given and explained in chapter 4. Each of these defects is as a partition separating man from God the Most High. This is what the prophet meant when he said, "But your iniquities have ever made a separation between you and God," which means that our sins, which, as we have said, are the evil qualities, are the partition which separate us from God.
Okay, so I would say that the Rambam is defining partitions, and if you hear me say partitions or veils or mechitzot, these are all interchangeable, so excuse me. Yeah. But I would say he is defining partitions as these are human flaws, right? They're moral or intellectual, right? So he's referencing the second chapter right? Where we talked about the chokhmah and binah, the understanding, right, from the intellectual, and the ethical stuff, the midot hatovot that we have. And we have the vices, right? So he lists the whole thing of ignorance and arrogance and anger and kas and greed. So he's mentioning all these other stuff as well. And he says each one of these are creating a veil. And his reference is Yeshayahu, right? Because Yeshayahu clearly says, right, that your sins are what separate you from God ultimately. And right, so like we were saying earlier, this is the idea that these sins, right, they are distancing us from the divine, right? So if I act in a virtuous way, I'm removing these barriers for myself, right? And the flawed person is walled off. I'm in this room and I'm by myself in this sense, or definitely away from God's presence. Now, the sages have spoken a lot, just in general, not that the Rambam is mentioning over here, that whether it's the Meiri, that there's your body can no longer be a vessel, right, for the Shekhinah, right? Only if I have, if I'm oriented properly, can I be this vessel? And this dulls my spiritual sensitivity. The Maharal, which we often talk about over here, is that he gives an example that God's light is sort of constant all the time. And by acting in this way, I'm basically, putting little stickers on the flashlight, right? I'm just dimming different lights by doing these. These are all the same concept, though. They're using different, language to get to these things ultimately. But ultimately, Rambam is saying that for true knowledge, you need both for true connection to God and to ultimately achieve prophecy, you need both this knowledge and this character purity, I would say. Or that's what he seems to stress. We'll get into that a little later on, where he sort of diverges in that a little. But we spoke about earlier.
I get character purity. I guess he says that, right, the moral, and I guess that you get that from moral and intellectual, right? The clarity, the moral clarity, and intellectual, the knowledge.
Now, we mentioned in the previous chapter, as you also, if you recall, we did this, we spoke about the mishpatim, right, the rational laws, and which we would say shape our ethics, and we spoke about the chukim, which are the divine decrees, right, ones which I wouldn't necessarily understand, which ultimately we said that allows me to cultivate my discipline, right? Because even though it's not easy for me to understand why I'm doing this because I'm being told to do this as well. And in the Moreh, in the Guide to the Perplexed, he also talks about there heavily about the perfection of the soul and the perfection of the body, right? So you could see these two routes that he's obviously it's very important for the Rambam. And like this, also as we spoke about the mitzvot, right? The commandments really being this, ethical training, right? The laws are also, they're curbing my passions. We spoke about that if I have a inclination, right, I'm using the mitzvot, not only are they just good ideas, but they're built into them, allows me to create this balance again, right? These mitzvot all have inside them these inherent bumpers, basically. If you're on the bowling alley, right, they're pushing you back into line. And whether I'm practicing in doing in tzedakah, like charity, or I'm praying, these lead to humility and generosity. So these are all connecting, obviously, as we're concluding over here with Rambam's general idea that he's talking about in this concept. And we see this also, of course, in famously in the Gemara, which talks about that Hashem created the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, right? But he created a vaccine, right, for this as well. And the vaccine is called the Torah, right? The drug of life is called the Torah, and it's its remedy. So really, I would say that this portion is just talking about that, and multiple we're going to be talking about that, how the intellectual flaws ultimately create this barrier for us. Hemshachnu?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there any comments that I'm missing? Balanced dot by RJ, correct. Balanced dot. Okay. ודע שכל נביא לא נתנבא אלא אחר שיהיו לו כל המעלות השכליות ורוב מעלות המידות והחזקות שבהן, והוא אמרם אין הנבואה שורה אלא על חכם, גיבור ועשיר. וחכם הוא כולל כל המעלות השכליות, בלי ספק. ועשיר הוא ממעלות המידות. רוצה לומר, ההסתפקות, מפני שהם קוראים המסתפק עשיר. והוא אמרם בגדר העשיר, איזה הוא עשיר? השמח בחלקו. רוצה לומר שיספיק לו במה שימצא לו זמנו, ולא יכאב במה שלא המציאו לו. וכן גיבור הוא גם ממעלות המידות. רוצה לומר שינהיג כוחותיו כפי הדת והעצה, כמו שביארנו בפרק החמישי. והוא אמרו, איזה הוא גיבור? הכובש את יצרו. It's also fun, just as Ben, I know for sure, and Gilad, whether you're aware of or when you were learning with us in Pirkei Avot, how you could see, well, first of all, obviously Pirkei Avot is showing up over here because this is, right, we're saying this is the Hagdama for Pirkei Avot. But once learning Pirkei Avot, it's very interesting to see how, where the Rambam is pulling these sources from. And Ben, we've already discussed how, some of this should sound very familiar from our previous discussions. So these are
in English.
Oh yeah, sorry. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Know then that no prophet received the gift of prophecy unless he possessed all the mental virtues and a great majority of the most important moral ones. So the rabbis said, prophecy rests only upon the wise, the brave, and the rich. By the word wise, they undoubtedly refer to all the mental perfections. By rich, they designate the moral perfection of contentment, for they call the contented man rich. Their definition of the word rich being, who is rich? He who is contented with his lot, which is from Avot. That is, one who is satisfied with what fortune brings him, and who does not grieve on account of things which he does not possess. Likewise, brave stands for moral perfection. That is, one who is brave guides his faculties in accordance with intelligence and reason. As we have shown in chapter 5, the rabbis say, who is brave? He who subdues his passions.
I guess my comment here is that I don't like the translation of hero to brave. So
I agree. I don't even know if that's how they translated. I wonder in Staria if they translated that way, like in previous chapters when we spoke about that. But I agree that Gibor is really talking about like a moral strength. What would be the translation? I'm trying to think in English. Mighty? Because like if you think about like the mighty hero.
Yeah, it's not exactly hero, but it's something like glorious in a sense. Like there's something about it that is who is the champion, I would say is the best
right, but like champion not in
like championing the cause, like not the champion of
right.
the competition.
Correct, exactly. That's an important distinction over there, because that's also a tricky word. The champion of the cause. Right. Okay, I think that's a very fair point. Thank you, man. Thank you, Gilad. Okay, so right, these are the prerequisites of nevuah, of prophecy. I should just mention off the bat, because we're going to talk about how wealthy Ashir is not actual, let's say, monetary wealth. However, we could read into that even if one wants to be a prophet, or let's say an effective prophet, so to speak, you would want them to be, you wouldn't want them to be able to be leveraged, so to speak. So being like independent, also like economically from the system, I think is also like, I don't know if as far as like a requirement, like we need to check his like bank account, but as far as someone that we would feel comfortable that he could move freely. So it's just something to think about, because clearly, as the Rambam explains and many others, we're not talking about Ashir is really ethically or spiritually, right? Not necessarily monetarily. But so the Chacham, the wise man, right? Which is and in Maimonides style, we're really talking about like an intellectual excellence over here, right? So clearly there would be sorry.
One more thing about Ashir. I think like there's a lot that goes into a man who is contented with his lot, because you can talk, and I think in this space a lot of people know like the distinction between relative wealth or absolute wealth, right? Which today we all live in, wealth that that couldn't even be afforded to kings,
Right.
not long ago. And so, like, it's something about, I think, their wisdom and understanding that you can't, when you talk about what makes a person rich in the sense that the prophets must be, it's not, it's neither of those two things. It's not relative wealth nor absolute wealth. It's about a person's ability to, it's not even live within his means, but more of
being
what
content. But that has to do with the histabkut, right? Which we'll get into that. But those are good points. Torah of the land, Gibor, mighty. Okay, that's there. Lihid Gaber, to overpower. I don't even know what would be to overpower. It would be to overcome. Right? But thank you for participating, Torah of the land. Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
I'm just saying, like, translations are never going to be ideal or complete. We try I think pointing out where the translations feel off is not because we can find the perfect translation, because I don't think there is a perfect translation, but noting a few of the different ones that could fit maybe gives more context to at least the listeners.
So what RJ is talking about over here, maybe unpack how Rambam sees prophecy here. So if we're going to talk a little about how he sees prophecy. We should be talking about it later on, but I might do like a reading of this chapter about prophecy from this new one of the new books of Rav Melamed, which is very good, and maybe there we could unpack a little more of like what that idea potentially means. But today we're still focusing sort of like on a bird's eye view on this. I don't know, bird's eye view, but like we're not getting in depth into what prophecy is specifically. Obviously, it's connected to the divine.
I think maybe a basic way to put it in terms of the Rambam is for him, it's the highest, right? It's highest degree. It's when you are fully oriented, then you reach the level of prophecy, which basically means that you are connected to God, and his will becomes your will, and kind of
right. But you could ask deeper, like, okay, what does that look like? Am I hearing voices? Am I matrix? Right. So I mentioned how definitely it's about hashgacha pratit, about divine providence, right? It's very eerie how Maimonides gives an example of, like, not everyone has divine providence. Right? Some people are just sort of like in their randomness, but those who want the divine providence have to be in this very, very, again, it's sort of right under prophecy, but you have to be in this very high place. And he gives an example, like if there was going to be a storm, someone with divine providence would be aware. They would like sort of tap into the matrix and know I shouldn't get on this boat. The reason it's like ironic is because that's how his brother dies ultimately on a boat, and Rambam goes into a very very, very deep depression. So clearly his brother did not have divine providence according to Maimonides' standard. Okay, so we were saying about the chacham, right? The wise man, he needs to be able to have obviously a full knowledge of the Torah, right? He has to have a deep understanding of truth, right? We don't have to get what that truth means, but Torah truth ultimately. And he needs to have, I would say, in Maimonides terms or Aristotelian terms, like he has to have like an abstract thinking mind, right? He has to be able to abstract these ideas. And obviously it's very important to Maimonides when he looks at these things as very abstract. And in other places in Yesodei Torah and other places in Rambam, he talks about that, prophecy only goes on someone that's like a very wise sage, ultimately. And that requires all these things of knowing the Torah, knowing the knowledge of the Torah as well. When he speaks about the Gibor, right, the champion, the mighty one, and like Gilad was pointing out, we're really talking about moral strength over here, right? We're not talking about the guy that ran the fastest. Rather, it's self-control, right? It's not physical power. Again, not to say that not having physical power could also be something great, but here we're literally talking about that someone has self-control over him, as God is tells Cain, right? Vatatim sholbo, right? Evil is on their doorstep. You will learn to control it. And we speak about Avot, of course, over here, the ethics of the fathers, and the subduing the evil inclination. I don't like the interpretation of how do they say it over here? yitzro, his passions, his inclinations. We talk about not having fear or not having anger, and according to Rambam, the prophet's always going to be able to, or almost always going to be able to, overcome his impulses with his intellect, right? He's going to be able to understand and orient himself and realize that, like, no, I need to control myself and really have like full mastery and governance over my my moral state, which is obviously extremely difficult, and hence it would be this champion, right? Because this is necessarily a feat. The ashir, like we spoke about earlier, there's the monetary explanation, and this is something that you were touching about, Gilad, right? That this is histakut, right? Being content with what you have, right? Which is or sameach bechelko, which is satisfied with your own portion or with your means, or living sort of within your means in a certain way. And I liked how you were also saying that, which is I'm free also at that point from greed or craving, or the neighbor's grass is greener, right? I don't have that need or that tendency, and we all live in a world where we look at things and we see shiny and Instagram lives that people have, but that leads to a troubled spirit. And if you're not chasing that all the time, then you are going to be much more calm, obviously, right? So this is someone that has a broad and outlook of the world. And I believe the Meiri says how it's someone, he gives a chofshiyut pnimit, really someone that has like someone that's wealthy is someone that has inner freedom from his desires also, right? That's how he would interpret that.
Just like circling back to where you started with let's say the comparison to the Eastern path, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is different to say like who is contented to something like asceticism, right? Like it's not about someone who can sort of renounce all their worldly possessions and thus they're rich. Like in Eastern traditions, it's more like living well within your means. It's not about denying yourself either.
Correct. Right. That's a very good point, right? I don't need to be a Shaolin monk. It's not necessary. And obviously we need to if I have what we spoke about, Chacham Gibor Vashir, right? Wise, tranquility, we'll call it, like as far as wealth, and we'll call strength disciplined. Okay, I have like a self-disciplined, and wisdom. We already said like intellect as far as the Rambam is concerned, right? So I need 3 of these things, which would give me the readiness, right, to accept prophecy in theory, right? So I need all these stuff: my clear intellect, my virtual soul, virtuous, not my virtual, my virtuous soul, and all these things will create, like, will make me into, like we said, like a vessel for the Shekhinah ultimately. Let's continue. Unless any questions, Ben?
Nope, no questions.
Okay. ואין מפני הנביא שיהיו אצלו כל המעלות המידות, עד שלא תפחיתהו פחיתות. שהרי שלמה המלך עליו השלום העיד עליו הכתוב, בגבעון נראה אדוני אל שלמה. Oh, why he's a prophet. I got to. ומצינו לו פחיתות מידות, והיא רוב התאווה. Exactly. וביאור בהרבות נשים, וזה מפעלות תכונות רבות התאווה, ואמר מבואר, הלא על אלה חטא שלמה. נחמיה. וכן דוד המלך עליו השלום נביא אמר, לי דיבר צור ישראל. ומצאנו אותו בעל אכזריות, אף על פי שלא שימש בהקיעים, בעובדי גילולים ובהריגות הכופרים, והיה רחמן לישראל. אבל בביאור בדברי הימים, שהשם יתברך לא הרשהו לבנות בית המקדש, ולא היה ראוי בעיניו לזה לרוב מה שהרג, אמר, אתה לא תבנה בית לשמי, כי דמים רבים שפכת ארצה לפניי. Very, very, very terrifying and sad moment. ומצאנו באליהו זכור לטוב. Let's wait with Eliyahu. Let's first unpack King Solomon. King
It
Solomon.
is, I'll just go through it. It
Please.
is not, however, an indispensable requirement that a prophet should possess all the moral virtues and be entirely free from every defect. For we find that scripture testifies in reference to Solomon, who was a prophet, that the Lord appeared to Solomon in Givon, although we know that he had the moral defect of lust, which is plainly evident from the fact that he took so many wives, a vice springing from the disposition of passion which resided in his soul. It plainly says, did not Solomon sin by these things? In Nehemiah.
You continuing, yeah?
Sure. Even David, a prophet, according to the words, to me spoke the rock of Israel, we find guilty of cruelty. And although he exercised it only against the heathens and in the destruction of non-believers, being merciful towards Israel, it is explicitly stated in Chronicles that God, considering him unworthy, did not permit him to build the temple, as it was not fitting in his eyes because of the many people David caused to be killed. So God said to him, thou shalt not build a house to my name, because much blood has thou shed.
Ay. Very, very tough. Okay, so we see here with Rambam was like throwing out a lot of ideas out there. He has to be holy this, he has to be intellectual that. Now we see he's, he's qualifying some things over here and really saying that you need like most of these sort of major virtues, but like you could potentially have some minor character flaws, right? And then he uses this, and we spoke about this already in the last chapter when he speaks a little about Moses, like where Moses sinned and how this was possible. So here again, after making these bombastic statements, he's not walking it back. He just, again, like I said, he's qualifying it and saying, I would also, tough. I'm trying to think how to break this out, but we have to ask, it's a real question. Like, how are we judging these giants, right? Like, are we judging them based on like today's barometer? Like, how are we looking at the world? This is like a world where Hashem, God, was like present in their life. So we can't really think what that looks like, a world where prophecy is there and revelation is around us. So, to us, it sounds like how it's Solomon sin. He's Solomon. God's talking to him. On the other hand, it's a mistake to think, and many people do this, definitely in the ultra-Orthodox communities. They look at Abraham or the patriarchs, like they were the heads of religious institutions like yeshiva, right? They were not these kind of people, right? It's not that we can't see them as they're. It's wrong to think of like the holiest person you could think of and times it times 5, and like that's what Abraham or that's what Solomon looked like. We have to realize that they're living in a completely different world. So we have to be very careful when we're judging them based on today's values. And if you look at in Deuteronomy, right, when God says like if you don't heed my commandments, right, it's not going to rain. And you could ask yourself, like, to us, that sounds like so ridiculous. But to a person living at that time who's clearly aware of God's presence, right? Not raining means to him that like Earth is unbalanced. And if Earth is unbalanced, then I'm unbalanced with Earth. And like there's an issue over here because God's presence and its connectivity to everything is more apparent. So on one sense, like all these things are connected. And on the other sense, because of that, there's also a tremendous pull for idol worship and these kind of things.
Wait, so what
Please go ahead.
I'm just, if you can kind of dive in and explain what point you're trying to make specific.
I'm trying to make that even before we get into this, like we have to even ask, how are we judging these people, right? We're saying right now, like if you're just thinking like a philosopher right now, it's really, or like if I want to understand abstract truths or fundamental truths, I don't need to know. I could be a jerk. I could be a murderer and still know physics, right? Like that doesn't deny that relationship. However, for prophecy, Moses, Rambam is saying like, yes, intellectually you have to reach that level of perfection. But as far as your midot, right? Like the Torah and prophecy was given to people, and people aren't angels. And that's why there has to be some room where we realize humans are flawed. That doesn't mean they can't receive prophecy. It's not just not like what, let's say, the philosophers would just assume that it's just these abstract ideas. Rather, there's a personality, there's a will that we're talking to. But for that will to be talking to someone, there needs to be, you're talking to someone, and that someone is flawed. Then I started getting into the concept of what does that mean Abraham and these patriarchs are flawed. Like, to us, it could seem crazy to even think, like, how did Solomon actually sin, right? The Torah tells you not to do this. You're the wisest of all the people. How is this happening? So we could dive in a second to the answers of why Solomon sinned. But I was prefacing it by saying that even when we're judging them, we should be careful when we judge them, because they're living in a completely different reality.
Right. I mean, my knee-jerk reaction is like, I don't think that it's unreasonable for me to think that somebody like Solomon will sin. Obviously, I think highly of him, but it seems, but yeah, so that's my knee-jerk. So it's interesting that you have to, some people will need that caveat.
Well, he's the wisest of all men.
Right. Yeah, I understand. But still, I mean, I've never seen anybody that doesn't sin. I've never heard of it. So, I mean, maybe because I hear all these stories already, then for me, it kind of seems at this point, maybe obvious, but that's just interesting, but that's not the main point, I think.
But I guess that's a difference in like the, say, central figures in Judaism compared to other religions, right?
Right. Yeah.
We're not perfect.
Yeah.
I'm saying like that. I know very, like, my knowledge is very limited of other religions, so I don't want to like undermine their deep philosophical underpinnings. But in general, I would say that a lot of central figures in the way that they're portrayed is counter to how they're portrayed in Judaism. Like King David, anyone who studied King David knows probably more about Bathsheba than about like all of the progress that Israel made during his time, right? Where they definitely know about Goliath, but they know about Bathsheba as well. And
ironically, that's not what Maimonides focuses on here with David, right?
Yeah,
because he repents, right? So Maimonides is aware of that and saying, like, while that is a flaw, right? Like, I'm talking, Maimonides is focusing over here on like where someone didn't repent, right? So not only like by not saying this, we also like you're saying, anyone that is at least aware of that story, whether it's by Leonard Cohen or anyone that's read the Bible, you could see that like that's clearly there, and that also leads credence to, in a certain way, to the authenticity, or let's say of the Bible, because of this. I forget the exact term, like sort of the embarrassment factor, right? The fact that we're willing to talk about all the issues, all the times Israel failed, right? Like that's not really, like you're mentioning, how the king spoke about it.
I don't really find that as the most useful sort of angle for me to look at it.
Sure.
I'm not looking for the authenticity or inauthenticity of
Understood.
the Bible, but of the like sort of mythical aspects of it, right? Like choosing to present it, I think, is somewhat more similar to things that you do doubt the authenticity of. You could say like Greek or Norse mythology.
Right.
The gods themselves are very flawed, and it could be very embarrassing. I don't think like that's necessarily about authenticity.
Well, I think maybe authenticity, maybe not in the literal sense, but in the character building sense, or the character, right? It's like in a story, you sometimes, when you see the flaws, when you see those little flaws,
it's relatable.
But I would say one, it's relatable, and two, it's like the cultural grammar, as many would call it, because, right, like if you talk about building or writing a good drama, right, you would talk about the character has to have a character flaw, and the character flaw has to come into play within the action of the
whole arc
movie. There has to be an arc, and they could either sort of triumph over their character flaw, or they could fail their arc and fall into sin. Like, Star Wars is the best example of showing that, but it's everywhere, right? Like,
yeah. Yeah, I
So,
remember.
I think actually,
If I would look at movies, when I used to watch movies, if I would see, I remember seeing a movie and the character had like a how do you call that? Like a hand, like a brace, I guess. Had a brace for at the beginning of the story. Had a brace for no reason, and apparently there was some kind of like backstory. And I said that I bet that this is like this movie. The script has to be it has to be based on a book or something because I knew that books they spend way more time to build character, so you can see. So in that way, it's almost like a signal to something being a lot more holistic in that sense. I don't know if I had anything else, but that was just kind of like an interesting detail.
I'm thinking about the Star Wars idea. I wanna develop it a little just on the King Solomon front. But first, I wanna just mention you could notice over here that King Solomon and King David, Rambam also has to qualify that they're prophets. Because like it's clear about Moses and the other prophets, but he's already saying like some of you might ask. So he says like, no, King David receives prophecy right King Solomon receives it at Givon, and King David also like he's saying right through the Psalms. So first of all, that's just interesting that and he talks about this more in the guide where he shows different instances where King Solomon was a prophet. Even though in some places he actually mentions that it was actually Ruach HaKodesh, right? Which is like the Holy Spirit, I guess, but like that's like sort of a lower level, but just like a little footnote because he mentions it over there. But he talks about how King Solomon has this Rova Te'ava, right? This
Lust,
overinclination, excessive desire, right? For like, and we see this by the many wives that he has, right? And this is a violation of what we learned in Deuteronomy about money and horses and women, which presumably ended leading him astray, right? And he focuses by mentioning like Nehemiah, right? The prophet himself is talking about how King Solomon sinned over here. We do need to ask, and this relates to Star Wars. Let's say you said he had many wives and he had like excessive desires, like sure, okay, but the Midrash tells us about like 1,000 wives. Right? Or like I'm saying, so like he had like that little self-control, like 1,000 wives. So there is an interpretation that like, the 1,000 wives is really, these were political marriages, right? This was really to sort of expand the kingdom, create peace. And Luke, right? He was identifying divine sparks in Darth Vader. Here, King Solomon is identifying, like we spoke about many times in Joseph, going down to Egypt and other places, he's identifying with his great wisdom, right? He's like, I'm seeing beyond, they're bowing down to Ra, they're bowing down to this person, but ultimately, it's really talking about God. So I'm going to let the people, I'm going to let, famously he'll let his Egyptian wife bring in idol worship into the temple. And his attitude is sort of like in his John Nash space, saying like, yeah, like those things don't really bother me. I'm like past that in a certain way. I'm like really looking at the whole picture. And by marrying all these people, I'm going to be able by myself to sort of elevate the whole world. And it seems like, he couldn't actually do that, right? He thought he could do that, but it ended up being causing him to get into trouble. And some sages even say the sin was by not taking everyone with him, right? Which is like, you let them, in your mind, you sort of went off to do your abstract thing, but you left the people with this idol worship and they were not in the place to actually be able to handle that. To them, that was too confusing. So I would just say that's just like a different reading into like why it was 1,000, because that does seem like a little excessive, but maybe he was a real, lover ultimately. But again, we see over here that this is, clearly this is this hindered Solomon's prophecy, but it doesn't completely deny his prophecy, right? That's what we're keeping sort of here. That's why my mind is giving these ideas. So when he goes to King David, right, again, like we said, he's showing him that he's a prophet. But here too, he's talking about this achzariyut. What is it translated to here? Cruelty? Harshness?
Yeah, cruelty.
Okay, cruelty. Okay, so Now they also explain that he's a warrior, and even though he's spilling blood like for the right reasons, right? He's attacking his enemies. Nevertheless, we see that this horrible pasuk, right, where Hashem is telling him that like you can't do this, right? Like you're not going to be able to build the temple because your hand is your hands are full of blood. Now the midrash tries to soften this by saying that he was built for a different purpose. There's a famous story of King David where he's sort of looking to where to build the temple, and he pulls out like this rock, and like water starts flooding the whole world, and it's the foundation stone of the world, and like flooding usually means like too much chesed, right? It's sort of out of control abundance, and that could be that create a flood ultimately, right? A little water is sustaining, too much water you could drown, and it's sort of the whole personality of David. God was saying like if you build this temple right now, it's sort of going to last forever. It's going to be too powerful. Like, and that's not sort of the mission. That's not the screenplay I've envisioned, God is saying. And so like, you can't build this. You're up to building this stage. It's sort of like when Moses doesn't go into the land, right? It's not because you, Moses, are not the right, you're not fit, but rather if you do it, it ends up creating something that's like too powerful. Moses, if you go into Israel, they won't be able to appreciate Israel probably because you're here with me. David, if you represent sort of kingdom, if you build this kingdom, then they won't actually be able to detach from you. But again, there's different interpretations. That's just one that's trying to be a little more loving to King David. But ultimately, we're seeing that this divine inspiration, right, is possible even if I'm not yet perfect, right? So I can't let my flaws dominate me. But there is a realization that there's a continual work on your midot, right? You never get to a place where like now you've won, you did it, and you don't need to grow anymore, right? Even the prophets were not perfect, and even the prophets had to, constantly work on themselves, right? Which is like we said, the Torah wasn't given to angels, right? We don't idealize perfection.
Right. I mean, I heard somebody say something that was useful about I think it was about Shmona Parakim, about 8 chapters, and the fact that in any philosophical work, or majority, I guess, in philosophical works, what you do is you define mostly what you're trying to do, or a lot of what you're trying to do is to define terms. So you're really kind of trying to squeeze out, make sure that people understand the definitions, and in that sense, it makes things look more not deterministic, but maybe binary, right? You're either this or this, but then after you go down and okay, now that we've spoken about all this theoretical, kind of defined all our terms, now let's think about how this applies in the real world with dynamics, with time and space, right? Sometimes you're tzaddik gamut, sometimes you're rasha gamut, sometimes, right? There's more to it. It's not binary anymore when it's not below the ideals, right? When it's not theoretical. And I found that useful.
I would say though that, let's say the prophet, we should also be fair that these, presumably Rambam is saying this is like an achievable goal, right? So this is saying like, if you want to be Arnold Schwarzenegger, right, of the mind, like he's not taking cheat days, right? Like if you're like just like half working out twice a week, right? Those are great things. You should work on your characters, and more people should be doing that. But like the people that really work on their body fully, right? Like I'm just using this as an example. They don't mess around, right? It's regimented. They're doing it. There's like the work is constantly being done sort of to get to that place. So while practically, for day to day, we have to give people tools how to do this. But here Rambam is really sort of, it's setting like a very, very, very hard bar on sort of what the expectation is. Not that it's impossible to get to, but rather that like it requires very hard work.
Yeah.
I wanted to add two things. One, since you mentioned the flood, I think related to this is the in the story of Noah, like the first, the first or the second verse there. Ish tzaddik tamim haya bedorotav, and bedorotav, like in his time he was a righteous man, is interpreted in both ways. Like there are two different interpretations, saying like, is it that he was righteous despite he was righteous in any generation, even though his time was very sinful, or he was righteous only relative to his generation, and he wouldn't be counted in anything as anything special in Abraham's generation.
Right.
So that just I
Right,
think
it's relative. Just
has relevance with this as well, right? Like
right. Just with that idea, the reason the rabbis use Abraham as an example, right? Because they could use anyone, really. Once the rabbis are opening it up, like everyone's fair play. The reason they use Abraham is because in Abraham's period, there is someone who is sort of is participating in the archetype of Noah. So that person is Lot, Abraham's nephew. And the way we see that is Lot is required to be saved, and Noah is required to be saved. There's destruction. Everything gets destroyed besides Lot and his family. Everyone gets destroyed between Noah and his family. There's the element of after the world was destroyed, right? What happens afterwards? With Noah, we see there's some sort of improper sexual behavior, right? His son sees him that he's completely naked. Mm-hmm. He looks onto him. He doesn't turn his head. And with Lot, we have him and his daughters, right? We have the incest story. So Chazal was saying, like, we could see there's parallels over here. So like, this is what Noach looks like if you compare him to Abraham. And that is Lot is not an evil person, but clearly at the standard of Abraham, he falls short. But that was a very good point, Gilad. Should we continue, Ben? What's your timing like?
Yeah, we can continue.
Okay. So we continue now with Elijah, I believe. Yes, mm-hmm. Correct. ומצאנו באליהו זכור לטוב. I love that they all say that. מידת הרגזנות, ואף על פי שימש בה בכופרים ועליהם היה כועס. Like he said about King David, he was still, killing bad people. אבל אמרו חכמים שהשם יתברך לקחו ואמר לו שאינו ראוי למשול בבני אדם ולהיות להם לכהן. מי שיש לו קנאה כמו שיש לו, כי ימיתם. וכן מצינו בשמואל שפחד משאול, וביעקב שפחד מעשיו, שפחד מפגישת עשיו. אלו המידות וכיוצא בהן, הן מחיצות בין השם יתברך עם הנביאים. ומי שיש לו שתי מידות או שלוש מהן בלתי ממוצעות, כמו שביארנו בפרק הרביעי, נאמר בו שראה השם יתברך מאחר שתי מחיצות או שלוש. wouldn't it be או שלושה?
מחיצה יפה.
מחיצה אחת.
Yeah, מחיצה אחת. Correct. The Rambam was right. Sorry. Okay.
Wait, no, מחיצה אחת, then שלוש. Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, שלוש מחיצות.
Mm-hmm. Wait, where am I going? Okay.
Wait, where you go?
They're kind of near the Hebrew. Just find Elijah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I was looking for. Sorry.
We find also
that Elijah gave vent to his anger, and although he did so only against unbelievers, against whom his wrath blazed up, the sages declared that God took him from the world, saying to him, "He who has so much zeal as thou is not fit to guide men, for thou wilt destroy them." Likewise, we find that Samuel feared Saul, and that Jacob was afraid to meet Esau. These and similar characteristics were so many partitions between the prophets, peace be unto them, and God. He of them who had two or three qualities which did not maintain the proper medium, as is explained in chapter 4, is said to have seen God from behind two or three partitions.
Can you go scroll back up for a second? Higher up, more. To all the way to the top where you started with Eliyahu? No, we went too far. More. Okay.
No.
Yeah, I wanted to see how are they saying Ragzanut here again?
He vent to his anger. Gave vent to his anger. Wrath blazed up.
By the way, you notice that they also don't translate Zechur Latov over here.
Yeah, which is odd, but
Yeah.
they also don't translate Alayhim Shalom. So
Yeah. With brevity.
Sure, I'm down with that. Okay. Interesting. So interesting. Okay. So anger or kanaut is really like zealotry, right? That's someone like being like a zealot, right? So, sorry, you want to say something, Gilad?
You can go ahead. I'll bring it up later.
So let's first put things into context for a second, right? This is like after 3 years of like not a famine. What's a batzoret? A drought. After 3 years of a drought, right? Elijah finally shows off with a famous story with the Nevi'eh Habal, right, on the top of Mount Carmel. He does his whole magical thing. Fire comes down from the sky, and everyone bows down and says like Hashem is one, right? It's like a big move, right? Really, he should be like we should be seeing him as the hero. However, right after that happens, Isabel, where the name Isabel comes from, she comes out and says like, okay, let's smoke this dude, right? Let's get rid of him. And if all the people were with Elijah, if there actually was like suddenly everyone like now was like in love with God again, then her threat would have no sway. The reason that he needs to run away is because it like he might have impressed the people on the mountain, but it still wasn't enough to like yank people out of their space. So you could see that like even at his high point, right, when he does this big win, it still doesn't manage to impress the people, right? So like he still fails in that sense, like as a prophet, which is very, very which is very, very sad. And it talks about over here where God is sort of upset, right? It says that the sages said that God took him, right? So there's in the verse where he goes to Mount Sinai, right? He has his own little Mount Sinai experience. There's parallels between him and Moses. God says this crazy verse and says, Malach hapo Eliyahu. What are you doing here, Elijah? Now, that's a very curious question because God told Elijah to go over there. So why is he asking, why are you here? And in the true sense, God is asking, like, what are you doing here on this earth? Like, do you understand what you're here for? It's like a challenge to Elijah. Like, now that you're actually here in front of me, what on earth are you doing? Right? So, and this very much, I have this, I'll tell my son, get over here for a second. I'll ask him, like, what are you doing? Like, what did you just do to your brother? Right? So this is like a real sense of like, do you even know where you're at? And with
right,
the
that's the same question in Bereshit with Adam, right? Ayecha, or I don't know how to say it.
Ayeka, right? So for sure, and the response, you want to be like Hineni, right? I'm present, I know where I am. Clearly, that Ayeka is reverberating all the way until Abraham answers it for the first time, right? Abraham says, like, I know where I am, right? I'm walking in front of God. I don't need to be walking aside of him. And this is also why when the rabbis are alluding over here to God taking Elijah, right? Saying like, you're clearly a prophet, right? And you're clearly a very good dude, but there's a mismatch with you and the people. And we see this again or the sages tell us with Hanoch, with Enoch, that eventually he gets taken away, right? Because there was a mismatch with him and the people. And our sages say that, he didn't manage to explain to the people on earth the ways of Hashem. And that's why they ultimately wanted to kill him. So God wanted to free him from that. Later on in the Zohar and other places, we talk about how Hanoch turns into Sar HaPanim, Metatron, the highest level angel, right? The sort of God's face, so to speak. Well, not God's face, but sort of the first presence that we're seeing, and that's a whole other discussion. But even Metatron's name is in the Zohar is Yehoel, which is the same letters of Eliyahu. There's a play over there, which these are two similar figures, which are like there's a mismatch with them and Earth, and they're taken away from Earth, quote unquote, living, which is get too deep into that idea. Please.
I want to add something about Elijah and what they're saying is I think in here he says אינו ראוי למשול לבני אדם כי מי שיש לו קנאה כמו שיש לו כי ימיתם. It's like there's a Bertolt Brecht poem that says something like, even the anger at injustice would warp your facial features to make you an angry man, right? Like
That's
it's
nice.
even like even if your wrath is aimed at the things that you ought to be wrathful against, right? That doesn't make it now virtuous.
Right. I mean, this is what Jacob tells Levi and Shimon, right?
And Shimon v'Levi klei chamos to him besodam afu nafshi ve'afitzam b'Yisrael. Yeah, they get into a lot of trouble because of their extreme.
Right. It was valid what they did in a sense, but it was too easy for them to do it, and they kept going the same route. So
I mean, that's right. That's very good, right? So unmoderated zeal, ultimately, even like you said, even for the truth, not only does it block the prophetic connection, it also creates damage to the people in the sense of being a prophet, right? You could just say if you're an individual that affects you, but right. So if you're yelling at your kid and he did something wrong, but if that's the method, right? So the lesson's not being learned, and potentially you're also creating more trauma by doing that, right? So I think that's I like that idea, that pull, right?
Yeah, and I think specifically here, I think like they are saying, right, ki amitam, right? And I think like even if you don't physically, punish them by death for not being as good as they ought to be, I think there's a spiritual death of the people you ought to lead, right? Like that's not, if your zealotry is so much and you have no
patience,
compassion, tolerance, and inclusion to those things, then I think like that's true. And specifically, I feel like that's certainly a part of the world we live in today in terms of polarization and the way that like we see the sort of discourse.
Facts don't care about your feelings, right? That's not what you want to be saying.
In a sense, right? Like
it's right, exactly. You obviously need to be more sensitive about that. I mean, that in a certain way, that is why God is sort of gifting Moses not going into Israel. Because after what happened with the stone, he's saying like, bro, like it's slipping. The mask is slipping. You're not, like, once they go into the land, there's going to be so much complaining. You don't even know, like, you're not, like, imagine Moses during the period of the judges, right? He would lose his mind. He'd be like, it's not, and we could see that in Elijah, which is like, this is what he would have turned it into. You would have turned it into, like, it wouldn't have worked, even though earlier Moses clearly is constantly praying for Israel, right? He shows a lot of mercy and love for them, but we could sort of see that slipping. I'll just mention that in Malachi, he talks about the famous verse of Elijah coming back, the Yeshiv Levavot al-Banim, right? So the fathers and the sons, that is sort of a repentance for Elijah. The fathers representing sort of the history, the tradition, right? What he wants to be zealous for, the things that shouldn't change. However, here he has to realize that he's going to have to end up blessing the sons that actually end up changing the ways of the father. There's more flexibility, there's more movement, and Elijah, the one that was very zealous, has to ultimately be the one that's going to be there and usher in the children, the sons, who are clearly going to be experiencing something else. Rav Kook talks about how with the establishment, like not the establishment of the state, but coming back to the land of Israel, he sees or Eliyahu Ole, right? The light of Elijah is rising, right? This is like the sense that like the sons have returned, and even though they're participating in what Jacob will call the devil's work, being it the state of Israel, Zionism, or just the expression of Jews in their land, which some people could see as heresy or going off the path, Rav Kook saw as the light of Elijah returning, right? These are the sons coming back, and they're definitely going to look different than the fathers. But we shouldn't have that standard necessarily of the fathers, not because we've lowered our standards, rather because we realize they've expanded. But I digress. We move on with who else do we mention over here? Shmuel, right? So there's King Saul, right? So he obviously is very scared. Not King Shaul. Shmuel the prophet is scared for his life when he goes to anoint King David, right? And being scared that he's going to get killed. This is sort of like the Rambam is seeing this sort of like as a minor lapse, right? Of courage or trust in God, that he was nervous about this, right? So even the great prophets still have to deal with this fear, and the fear which stems from the not trusting in God would be a spiritual blemish, right? At the very least to hinder prophecy, right? Because in theory, you're taking on the revelation, you know it to be true. How is that happening? And some have argued that even Moses, when he was arguing with God at the burning bush, right, there was like a lapse over there at the time because there was like a untrusting element over there. With Jacob, with Yaakov, not our Jacob in the TLC, but our patriarch Jacob, right? He has the fear before he meets his brother Esau, right? But when he's on the way back, he has to see this. And despite God making promises to him, we still see like this expressed anxiety, right? When he leaves everyone alone. He goes in the middle of the night, and I would say, like, again, here too, this is being criticized as like this, like, this lapse, right? Or this like a lack of complete trust, like we were talking about. And I would say that there is an interpretation that his fear was, the rabbis say his fear was that he was going to kill the other, right? And then the rabbis say, what does it mean he was going to kill the other? Like his army was much smaller than Esau's, rather that during this battle, he was scared that, like, if I go into battle right now with my brother, there are some, this goes back to the divine sparks. There are some good virtues and elements inside Esau that if I fight him right now, if I wipe him out, so to speak, like, am I throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? By doing that. So I'm very nervous about attacking. I can't attack him yet because I don't know where his values are. I don't know if I'm allowed to be doing so. And that's why our sages say that at night, God sent Sarosh el Esav, right? The angel of Esau is who he's fighting at night, according to one of the interpretations. But that is in context of what I said earlier, which is, if Jacob's fear is the values of Esau, which we'll call like Edom, or the sages will call, let's say, Rome, so to speak. So all night, Jacob is wrestling with these ideas, right? There's this inner battle happening, right? If it was an angel, why is he not beating Jacob, right? Like there's a whole inner conversation that's going on with Jacob and the angel, where he's saying, like, bless me, what's my name? Like there's sort of looking himself in the mirror and asking, challenging himself. What are my values? Who are the values that I'm fighting? Once that battle happens, the next day, Jacob could finally actually physically now address his brother, because there's been like this inner battle that already happened. But again, that's like sort of like a side discussion of what that fear would be. But generally, according to the Rambam, we're talking about this lapse in faith. So I would say Rambam, in this section is really concluding that, again, the anger or the impatience or the zealotry we're talking about, all these, of course, are spiritual veils or oppressions, right? They get in the way. And he ends it over here, which is like, these are the prophets that we're talking about that see between 2 to 3 cloudy veils, right? That's because they don't see clearly, and these are them. So there's people that are actually playing at that level of 2 to 3 levels below. Again, like Moses is sort of the gold standard in that sense. And we could even here, Rambam is also sort of still stressing the derech emta, right? The middle path of, let's say, really a balance of all your traits, ultimately. That even if you have momentary lapse of emotions or your inclinations, right, which lower your prophetic vision or quality, right, there, it's still an ongoing conversation. You always have to be working on yourself. By the way, it's true also with nonprofits, right? Which is like, even closeness to God is just in the way all 3 of us, or 2 of us, or sorry for throwing you in there, Gilad, but us wanting to connect to the divine, even if we have no delusions of grandeur of receiving prophecy, right? Nevertheless, like these character traits, being angry would still be a partition or a veil in seeing things clearly, talking calmly, being able to connect to people day to day, and of course, to connect to God, even at the low level that we try to connect to God in, these would still be things that we should be working on, right? So even if I'm not trying to achieve prophecy, these are all things I should be focusing on.
I would say that the final part, I think, sort of elucidates the metaphor, and I think it is sort of it's compatible in as many of Maimonides' work is with, let's say, the Greek philosophers, or generally the concept of enlightenment and philosophy in general, because of this visual metaphor. You have, because you could think of like a glass brick, right? Like there's you have these like warped glass bricks that you could put like in windows, so you couldn't see much of what's behind it. And if you make them thinner and thinner, then you can see more of what's behind them. And if they're very thick, then you can't really make it out. And like mathematically, you could actually sort of compute when there's too much data lost, right? Within that that process, that like you're not seeing anything out of it, and I think there's a sense where he's saying, right, like there is an analogy here between what you would consider prophecy and what you would consider enlightenment, which is when those partitions have become thin enough so that the light coming through as this clarity of like what's behind that those few partitions can only be clear if you've removed enough of them,
right?
De-warped enough of them.
I've heard a metaphor, like a visual metaphor, and the Kabbalists have this as well, right? Where you have, if you think of yourself as a mirror, and there's a light that is shining onto your mirror, which is a vessel. If it's opaque, or if it has bugs on it or whatever, dust, then the light that it's going to reflect wherever you're directing that light to is not going to be in the same quality of the original light, or it's going to be diminished, or it's going to be moving in different directions, not in the place that you wanted to direct it to. So if you clean it up, you can reflect the light much better and more cleanly and direct it. So I also found that kind of visually interesting.
The example I gave my son was with what is it called? The James Webb, the new telescope. So if you look, I got to this example. We were in the pizza store, and there was the Guinness Book of Records, 1994. And that was just like this random book that was in the pizza store while we were eating. So we were opening it up. It's also funny because in 1994, they basically had like very few pictures. Most of it is just like words. And my son's like, like, I'm not going to like read, you're just going to read the Guinness Book of Records. Let's like show me all the pictures. But they show a picture of some sort of, it's like a star or a planet, but like, it's like so pixelized, like this like weird infrared picture. And then I showed him like on my phone, like what it looked like then again, like in like early 2000s, and what like it looks like now. And you just see like this image getting sharper and sharper and sharper. And then like you realize like, not only did we think that was another star, it's a moon. And really there's 7 other moons behind it. And really there's like a black hole behind it. Like, and you just suddenly seeing like, and there are also mathematical and practical ramifications. And for us, like, if that's true, then what I thought here was not true. And suddenly there's like this whole new truth. And it doesn't make we spoke about this once, Gilad, about how like up until like Newtonian physics, we got to like one level of truth. And then like we see further than that, it doesn't mean Newtonian physics is wrong. It just means it's limited with how far it could take you. And the more you could see, suddenly you realize like, there's so like sort of levels of truth. We're not like what the prophet saw under 2 and 3 levels of partitions, right? It sort of will only let him get to levels of Newtonian physics, right? He's not going to be able to play with Wi-Fi because like it's just not there for him to get that information. Mm-hmm. I don't know if my son just fully understood that, and there was like there was more images involved, but like I was trying to explain like how we try to see closer and closer. I unfortunately need to stop over here, but we actually did a